As we continue to talk about attitudes in general and persuasion in particular, this time let's focus on the source of a persuasive communication. Here's a statement that's probably not going to shock you. We can't change all people's minds all the time. And I guess that has some good points and some bad points. I mean, it would be nice if we had that type of power, but keep in mind, if that type of power existed, people would wield that power against us, and we wouldn't want that. I guess my general point that I wanted to make is that we're all unique people who come to the table with our own unique perspectives. It's not like when I try to persuade you of something, I'm always going to be able to get through to you. That's an oversimplification of the persuasive process. And it actually reminds me of a conversation that I had with a colleague of mine. We weren't seeing eye to eye about some policy issue on campus, so we were discussing it, and he came to my office. And he said to me, if I'm right about the way I see this issue, I will persuade you. And if you're right about the way you see this issue, you will persuade me. And I thought to myself, that's not true at all. We already know what the other person is likely to say, and we've already thought of counter-arguments. So here's a general point. Persuasion in general decreases as the significance of an issue or the importance of an issue increases, and also as your familiarity with that issue increases. And that makes sense because if an issue is really important to you and you're really familiar with it, it's likely that you've really thought it out, and it's also likely that you've dug in. You've already determined what your stance is going to be on that issue. But by identifying some key factors in the persuasive process, we can strengthen the odds that some persuasive attempt is going to be successful. So we can't always change people's minds, but if we understand the persuasive process, we can craft a message so it's more likely to be persuasive. So what we're going to do is start picking apart the persuasive process so we can better understand when it's going to be successful and when it's going to be less successful. And in general, persuasive communications consist of three main factors. One is the source of the message. Another is the content of the message. And a third key factor is the audience to whom the message is being directed. So persuasive communications consist of who says what to whom. For now, we're going to focus on the source of the message. So in other words, we're going to focus on the who in who says what to whom. In general, credible, likable sources are more persuasive. So what does it mean to be a credible or a likable source? Let's take each one of those separately. Credibility in general is a blend of competency and trustworthiness. Competent sources are highly able. They're smart. They're knowledgeable. They're well-spoken. They're seen as experts. So why is it that experts are more persuasive? Well, experts are comforting to us. They're somewhat disarming because we assume that they know what they're talking about. So we pay more attention to what they have to say, and we're more likely to accept what they have to say. In other words, we're more likely to be persuaded by experts. So for example, Warren Buffett is a very credible source when it comes to investing advice because he's one of the richest men in the world. So if I see a news article that says it's going to discuss Warren Buffett's 10 rules for investing, I'm going to read that because I know that he's an expert. He has competency, which makes him credible. Now, think about this as well. Competency and credibility vary by context. So here's a picture of Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep is an amazing actress, and I think when it comes to that type of field, most people would see her as very competent and as an expert. However, Meryl Streep sometimes likes to talk about political issues. In that realm, she's not seen as an expert. So in that realm, she's not necessarily seen as competent. So in that realm, she's not necessarily seen as credible. So she will be less persuasive when talking about political issues, even though she has a huge audience, like for example, during an awards banquet. Now, contrast that with when I hear the same types of political arguments or political information coming from a trusted newsman like Lester Holt. He is seen as much more competent, and thus he has much more credibility. But as I mentioned, competency isn't enough. In order to be credible, you need to be competent, but you also need to be trustworthy. In order for you to be a credible source who might persuade me, I need to trust that you're telling me the truth. Now, much of our assessment of trustworthiness is just simply based on stereotypes. So stereotypically, when we think about like members of Congress or car salesmen, we don't see them as very credible. We don't see them as very honest. And that's what these numbers are that you're looking at right here. They're essentially honesty ratings. You can see like nurses, medical doctors, they're seen as very honest people. So it's just kind of stereotypical. And it also goes along, I guess, with the jobs that they have. I mean, of course, car salesmen are trying to persuade us to buy a car. They have an ulterior motive. They want to make money. Nurses and medical doctors, they're not necessarily trying to persuade us about something. They're just trying to inform us about something, our health. So all I'm saying is, in general, based on their roles and based on the stereotypes that exist in our culture, we tend to see some people as more trustworthy and other people as less trustworthy. And the people that we see as more trustworthy, they tend to be more credible, and thus they tend to be more persuasive. Let's continue to talk about trustworthiness a little bit. Here's a good example. Bernie Sanders, although he's a member of Congress, he's a senator, Bernie Sanders is indeed seen as very trustworthy. And that's because people perceive him to be fighting for the common man. It's almost if he's fighting against his own self-interest. And this brings up an important point. Remember when I was talking about car salesmen? When they're telling you about a car and they're trying to persuade you to buy it, we know that they have a self-interest in this deal. Because if you buy that car, they're going to make money. But when Bernie Sanders speaks, many people perceive him to be trustworthy because they're unable to see his own self-interest in many of the policies that he proposes. Let me give you an example from the other side of the spectrum. This is Wilford Brimley. He's deceased. He's an actor who made a lot of movies, and he was very popular. People loved him. People saw him as a grandfather. Well, he started endorsing a lot of products. So he would be selling insurance, he'd be selling medical equipment, he was selling oatmeal. And the point is, because he was endorsing so many products and people were able to see that he had some type of self-interest in it, they no longer trusted him. And in fact, it became a little bit of a joke. One week on Saturday Night Live, they had an actor portraying him, and they showed a commercial that started out with, "Hi, I'm Wilford Brimley for Tampax." So I guess they were just trying to make the point that this particular actor would endorse any product. So how can we trust him to tell us honestly about any one of those products? All right, well, I mentioned that credible and likable sources are more persuasive. Let's talk a little bit now about what makes a source more likable. Well, in general, likability is composed of two primary factors. One is similarity, and the other one is pretty obvious, physical attractiveness. You might not have thought much about similarity, but it's really pretty interesting because people who are similar to us, they're essentially informal members of our in-group. If they share some type of characteristic with us, then we form a more immediate bond to them. It's almost unquestionable. So for example, it's not uncommon that I get calls and people are trying to raise money. Well, it's also not that uncommon that I will get calls from Ohio University trying to raise money. Sometimes they're really smart from a social psychological perspective, and they will have an OU student call. Now, when I answer the phone and I find out that the person that I'm talking to is an OU student, I kind of immediately bond with that student because I know that that student is like me. I was an OU student. I'm now an OU professor. So this person is part of my in-group. Now, if that person is like me and that person is part of my in-group, that person is going to be more persuasive. It's simply harder for me to say no to someone who I have that much in common with. Another characteristic that leads to likability is physical attractiveness. And I know it doesn't seem like the world should work this way, but it does. People who are physically attractive just tend to be more likable, at least initially. And when a physically attractive source is part of some type of persuasive campaign, like in this example, Sofia Vergara is selling Diet Pepsi, we're going to pay attention. At least men are going to pay attention. I know I pay attention. I have no intention at all of buying or drinking Diet Pepsi, but if I see her on a commercial, I'm going to watch it. So physically attractive people are more likely to get our attention, they're more likely to keep our attention, and there's also some evidence that we're more likely to try to please those people. So for example, there was a really neat research study done back in the 1970s by Shelley Chaikin. She's a well-known social psychologist. And what she did in this research study was manipulate the attractiveness level of people who were asking other people, these were students on campus, to sign a petition. So some of the students that were out there asking to have a petition signed were very physically attractive people. Other people were more average. And the petition had to do with keeping meat off of the menus in the cafeteria. When physically attractive people approached others, they were successful about 41% of the time. About 41% of the time, the people signed their petition. The more average-looking people were successful only about 32% of the time. So one thing that we'll cover later on is called the what is beautiful is good stereotype. And in general, when we see people who are beautiful, we tend to think that they have a lot of other good characteristics, and that seems to also filter down through their persuasive communications. So I guess the bottom line is, when physically attractive people speak, we're more likely to listen, we're more likely to continue paying attention, and there's some evidence to show that we're also more likely to follow through and actually act on that persuasive appeal. So for the reasons that we just discussed, the source of a message is obviously very influential. However, that's not always the case. And the time that that's not the case is when people are very involved in some type of issue. So personal involvement can limit source effects. When a message, a persuasive appeal, is very personally relevant, people are more likely to pay attention. And that makes sense, because if the message has something to do with them, they're more likely to pay attention to what that message is really saying. In other words, they're more likely to process that message via the central route. And when they do this, they're much less likely to be influenced by source characteristics. Let me give you an example of a research study that makes that point pretty clearly. During this research study, students were presented with persuasive communication, and there were a couple things that were manipulated. One thing was how involved those students would be in that persuasive communication. The persuasive appeal was all about implementing comprehensive exams for graduating seniors. Some of those seniors, some of those students listening to the persuasive appeal were very involved in the issue because they were told that these new exams would take place next year when they were graduating. So they would have to take the exams. Other students who were hearing the persuasive appeal were told that the new exams would not be implemented for another 10 years, so it wouldn't affect them. So some students were very involved because the new exams would affect them. Some students were not involved because the new exams would not affect them. Now, another thing that was manipulated was the strength of the arguments. Sometimes the students were hearing very strong arguments for why we should have these comprehensive exams, and sometimes the students were hearing weak arguments. So let's just look at the results from that perspective first. When students were really involved in this issue because they would have to take the exams, they were persuaded most when they heard strong arguments. When they heard weak arguments, they were not persuaded much at all. So that's a good example of how when you are highly involved in an issue, you are more likely to process that message via the central route. Now look at these students. These students heard the exact same messages. However, they knew that these exams were not going to affect them. So they were not very involved in what was going on. And as you would expect, they processed that information via the peripheral route. And remember, when people are processing information via the peripheral route, they're not really scrutinizing the arguments very well. So here we see a very small difference in the people's attitudes after hearing strong arguments and weak arguments. In general, it didn't matter all that much how strong the arguments were. Now here's where things got more interesting, and here's where things are tied into source characteristics or source effects. Some of the students in the research study were hearing the message from an expert source, a college professor. Other students were hearing the persuasive appeal from a non-expert source, a high school student. When people were highly involved because those comprehensive exams were going to affect them, it did not matter how credible the source was because they were processing that information via the central route. And via the central route, I don't care if you're an expert or you're not an expert, I want to hear what you have to say. And in these experimental conditions, the only thing that was being manipulated was the expertise of the source. They're either highly expert or not expert. Did not matter. But now for the students who had a relatively low involvement in this issue because the comprehensive exams would not affect them, they were very influenced by who was speaking that message. And that's because they're processing that information via the peripheral route. Remember, when people are processing via the peripheral route, they're not paying attention to all the nitty-gritty of the message. It's just not that important to them. So they're relying on some superficial cues. Well, one superficial cue is the source characteristic, that someone is an expert or someone's not so much an expert. When these people were hearing the message from an expert source, they saw the arguments as relatively persuasive. They saw the idea for comprehensive exams as favorable. But when these students were hearing the persuasive appeal from a non-expert source, from a high school student, they were not persuaded. So just to sum up, my point is that source characteristics are very important. Sources that are credible and likable do indeed tend to be more persuasive, but that's most likely to occur when people are processing information via the peripheral route. When people are very involved in an issue and they're processing information via the central route, they are still going to be persuaded based on the strength of the arguments. Let's talk about the sleeper effect next. It's really a very interesting phenomenon that's related to source characteristics. Here's the basic point. Non-credible sources can have a greater persuasive impact over time. Let me give you an example of how this could work. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, some people discussed the idea that she might have been involved in a murder of a person who worked for Bill Clinton back when Bill Clinton was president. And I know that sounds crazy, and that's because it is crazy. And it's interesting, though, that this was actually printed, in some tabloids, and it was on the internet. But we need to keep in mind that different sources are associated with different levels of credibility. So if we saw this story printed and seriously written about in like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post, then it would have one level of credibility. But if we saw something like this printed in a tabloid like the National Enquirer, it would be associated with another level of credibility, much less credibility. Well, my point about the sleeper effect is this. When people learn information, like the information that you're seeing right in front of you, they remember that information, they think about that information, and they also associate it with the source that provided that information. But the sleeper effect says that over time, people often disassociate the source of the information with the actual information they learned. So a source that is not credible over time can become more credible when people forget where they heard the information. So this is the type of thing that's likely to happen. Someone will read about Hillary Clinton being involved in a murder in the National Enquirer, and they'll probably think that's crazy, this is just a tabloid. And then it might be 6 months down the road and somebody will be talking about it and they'll say, yeah, I remember reading about that at some point. Maybe there's really something to that, because they're no longer remembering where they read it. They're no longer remembering that the source did not have credibility. What's interesting is that this sleeper effect is most likely to occur, it occurs most reliably, when people learn about the source of the information after they've already read or heard about that persuasive message. So think about a situation like this. Let's say that someone comes up to you and they say like, hey, I heard that Hillary Clinton was involved in a murder. Then you talk about it a little bit. And then maybe you even talk about it with someone else. You start spreading that information. And it's only later that you find out that that information was originally published in the National Enquirer. And let's say that you don't really trust the National Enquirer, like most people, because it's a tabloid. So at that point, you'll pretty much discount that story. But remember what the sleeper effect is all about. Months later down the road, you might forget where that information came from. And when you hear other people talking about it, you're more likely in that situation to say, yeah, I remember hearing about that. And you might be more likely to think there's really something to it. And that's what the sleeper effect is all about. A non-credible source, in this case the National Enquirer, can have a greater persuasive impact on you over time when that message that you remember becomes disassociated with where you read it. The sleeper effect has been demonstrated in some research studies. In these studies, people are presented with some information, a persuasive appeal, and they're told that it either comes from a high credibility source or a low credibility source. Of course, in this situation, if the source has low credibility, people don't change their attitudes very much compared to if the source has high credibility. However, if you check their attitudes again over time, in this case 3 weeks later, we can see that even when there's a low credibility source, the people's attitudes tend to increase just a little bit. They become a little bit more persuaded. And people who heard that information from a high credibility source, that tends to lose its persuasive appeal. Because remember, they too, over time, are disassociating where they heard that information. So credible sources over time tend to have less persuasive impact, and non-credible sources over time tend to have more persuasive impact. Now, if you were to measure those people 3 weeks later, but this time remind them about the source of that communication, you won't see any sleeper effect at all. All right, my friends, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because there's more social psychology coming up soon.